From their studios, they can take you up there, to the moon.
I'm going to step off the limb now. It's one small step for man, one giant leap for... No, I guess you want to do it again. Okay.
But back in time.
The performance of a rocket motor is measured by thrust, which is a force. To calculate the thrust of the Saturn V rocket, we would multiply the mass flow of propellants, which was 15 tons per second, by the velocity of the propellants, which was 5,000 miles per hour. In addition, the Saturn V rocket burned a mixture of liquid oxygen and RP-1, a refined kerosene. Considering this information, could the Saturn V rocket have made it to the moon and back? In 1953, the calculations were performed by the man who built the Saturn V, Wernher von Braun. On page 14 of his book, Conquest of the Moon, he states that it is commonly believed that man will fly directly to the moon. But to do this, we would require a vehicle of such gigantic proportions that it would prove an economic impossibility. It would need to develop sufficient speed to penetrate the atmosphere and Earth's gravity, and, having traveled all the way to the moon, would still need enough fuel to land safely. The calculations were carefully worked out on the type of vehicle needed for the nonstop flight to the moon and return. The figures speak for themselves. Each rocket ship would need to be taller than the New York Empire State Building, 1,250 feet, and weigh about 10 times the tonnage of the Queen Mary, or some 800,000 tons. Fully loaded with fuel, the Saturn V weighed only 3,000 tons. The Saturn V rocket needed to have been 266 times more massive in order to have made it to the moon and back. Why? Here's the Earth. The actual diameter of Earth is 8,000 miles. The model you see here has a proportionate diameter of 1 foot. Now, the farthest any astronaut has ever traveled since the last man landed on the moon in 1972 was in the space shuttle. The space shuttle has never traveled more than 400 miles from the Earth. 400 miles may seem like a lot, but it is only 1/600th of the distance between the Earth and the moon. In proportion to the 1 foot model of Earth, this 400 miles converts to a mere half an inch that any astronaut has ever traveled into outer space after 1972. Yet, prior to that year, some believe man traveled 240,000 miles, or 30 Earth diameters, to reach the moon. This corresponds to a distance of 30 feet as illustrated in this model. How can it be that before 1972, men could have traveled to the moon, and since then, no one has been able to go more than half an inch? The answer, von Braun's calculations, were not off by a factor of 266. Men have never walked on the moon.
From an analytical standpoint, photographic anomalies have to be sought out with an understanding of lighting and shadows. The most straightforward is simple. When objects are lit solely by the sun, as all the scenes on the moon were said to be, after all, lighting equipment was not only impractical, it was unnecessary in bright sunlight, then all shadows, regardless of the landscape, will run parallel with one another and never intersect, as shown by this example. In these seldom-seen photographs, obtained from a rarely used auxiliary NASA archival site, it is clear that these scenes were lit with artificial light. These shadows, which are cast at different angles, are evidence that a second light source is being used. In addition, the sun would not cause an isolated hotspot like this, only an artificial light would. Again, intersecting shadows and another hotspot. And again. And again. It is simply impossible for this picture to have been taken with sunlight on the moon. Here, the shadows are shown to be as black as pitch. And yet here, completely in a shadow, the astronaut is lit up like a Christmas tree. How can this be?
Why don't you swear on the Bible that you walked on the moon? Why don't you swear on the Bible that you walked on the moon?
You want me to knock you in the head?
Well, I want you to swear to God on the Bible that you walked on the moon.
Okay.
If you walked on the moon, we're given the opportunity to swear to God that you walked on the moon.
I'm going to give you the opportunity to get the hell knocked out of you if you don't leave me alone.
I don't hit people, but you're going to be on the deck unless you get.
I'm heading out. I appreciate it.
And get the hell out of my house.
Well,
Take your stuff and get the fuck out. Why don't you quote me and say it's bullshit?
In the shadows in the wrong place. I don't give a damn about all that shit.
You're full of shit. If you show this publicly, you're open for a lawsuit. Okay?
Mr. Seibel, you do not deserve answers.
My name is Bart Sibrel, writer, producer, and director of A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Moon. I grew up as the biggest fan of the moon landings. As a teenager, an entire wall of my bedroom was dedicated to photographs of the first moon landing. A decade later, I was a filmmaker and worked at an NBC affiliate where I met a man in his 70s who worked for the space program during the development of Apollo. He asserted quite confidently that the moon landings between 1969 and 1972 were, number one, impossible, and number two, falsified to fool the Soviet Union about U.S. strategic capability during the Cold War. Upon further investigation, I uncovered several inconsistencies in the photographs that only a filmmaker would recognize. My suspicion was further heightened when I learned that since 1972, no country has sent astronauts higher than 400 miles above Earth. Yet NASA claims that in 1969, the Saturn V rocket took 3 men to the moon some 240,000 miles away. This is 600 times further than the space shuttle has ever flown, with only a 30% difference in fuel. 3 days after liftoff, the Apollo astronauts supposedly got into lunar orbit above the moon. Then part of the craft, containing 2 of the 3 astronauts, descended in a vacuum and 1/6 gravity down to the lunar surface. One astronaut supposedly hit golf balls on the moon while standing on the surface, and 6 other astronauts rode around in a moon buggy, all in a 250-degree environment. They then got back into the craft, and the top half of the vehicle popped up 60 miles above the surface to dock with a 3rd man in the command module, and then all 3 flew back to Earth. To do all this, the U.S. had to have made a phenomenal leap past the Soviets, who had the first satellite in space, the first animal in space, the first man, the first woman, the first spacewalk, first lunar satellite, and the first unmanned lunar landing. After spending $500,000 and 10 years researching this topic, I would bet my life that the moon landings were fraudulent. The results of my research are contained in the videos you can purchase from the site. I guarantee that these videos will convince you that the moon landing claims are truly absurd. Please take advantage of this opportunity to learn the truth about this important period in American history.